Ukraine is taking the war to Russia like never before, in its first big chance of winning in years, according to some observers. And Kyiv's campaign is extensive and constantly evolving, now including a 40-day influence operation. I'll put it all into perspective with an analyst in a moment. First, the latest developments. Videos on social media are said to show one of the heaviest Ukrainian bombardments to date. On Friday, Russia's defense ministry said its air defenses had intercepted 660 drones. There was an attack on a chemical plant in the Tula region, south of the capital Moscow, which itself was hit yet again, along with Crimea. More and more aerial assaults are causing chaos on the Crimean peninsula, depriving the Russians of a crucial launch pad. The strategic Ukrainian territory was illegally annexed by Moscow in 2014. Authorities there have declared an emergency.
This state of emergency is being adopted to streamline financial, contractual, and other relationships, as well as to address damage restoration issues. I ask everyone to remain calm, trust only verified sources of information. Together, we will overcome this.
Well, have a look at this video, published by eyewitnesses. Not what I'd call calm. Thousands of Russians fleeing Crimea. The independent Russian telegram channel Astra wrote on Friday the traffic jam stretched at least 15 kilometres. These pictures are being shared millions of times on social media, just like the footage of drone attacks on Moscow. And I'd like to know how that's affecting public opinion about the war. Ukraine is also extending its range inside Russia, intensifying airstrikes on energy infrastructure, hitting targets as far away as Siberia. That's over 2,000 kilometres from the front line. And it's grinding down the Russians by hitting their key supply lines to the front, wiping out oil facilities, power stations, weapons convoys, bridges. That's widening the fuel crisis for the Russian military in the occupied part of Ukraine, and open source data points to fuel rationing in dozens of Russian regions, so it's affecting the civilian population. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says they're doing everything to restore justice. In a post on X, he said, "I approved a 40-day influence operation for the service against the aggressor state, aimed at compelling it to end the war." I'd also like to know more about this new operation. I've got Maria Snegovaya with us, a senior fellow with the Europe, Russia and Eurasia program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. What's behind this 40-day influence operation, as it's known?
Thank you for having me. Ukraine is doubling down on its current advantage. It has received a technological advantage over Russia, primarily due to its longer range strike drones, including the Hornets drones, and access to Starlink that Russia's forces have been recently cut off. And in addition, it's summer. Accordingly, Ukraine is better positioned to mobilize its resources in this counteroffensive campaign against Russia, while Russia is probably awaiting another winter to intensify its terror campaign against Ukraine's energy grid that it's seen last winter. So this is the momentum that President Zelensky and Ukrainian military authorities are hoping to use to, so to speak, bring the war inside of Russia, as we see through these deep strikes into Russia-controlled areas and into big Russian cities, and hopefully change the battlefield situation to Ukraine's advantage.
But what's this influence operation actually mean? How do you interpret that?
So there are several elements, the military, political, diplomatic aspects that all work in combination. Militarily, Ukraine's hoping to really, as I said, use this important operational momentum to double down on it and to push further against Russia, including in particular in Crimea, which is just uniquely positioned for Ukraine to use it. It's an important logistical hub, but geographically for Russia's war in Ukraine, it is connecting Russian forces in southern Ukraine, but it's also positioned in a way that's geographically making it just more convenient for Ukraine to retake it. As we know, right, it's a peninsula that's linking to Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why Ukraine was transferred to Ukraine by Soviet authorities back in the day. And connecting it to Russia is the Kerch Bridge, the land corridor that Russia has been able to occupy. and since 2022. And so the goal of Ukraine right now is basically to try and cut off Russian forces using these strikes, consistent attacks on the bridge, railways, ports, fuel depots, and Russia's logistical infrastructure surrounding Crimea in a way that allows, but hopefully for Ukraine to even retake it back or at least achieve a strategic advantage. That's just part of the game, though, because there's also an economic pressure that's hoping to significantly affect Russia's energy revenues. As we know, since the start of the war, since the start of this year, 2026, Russia's economy has already been in significant trouble. The energy revenues have been declining until the recent war in Iran. Russia's economy was near in recession. It has essentially passed through the period of this early hype, the Keynesian type of hype that it experienced during the first couple of years of the war. And Ukraine is hoping to double down on it by reinforcing the fuel shortages that are already very visible, not just in more remote regions of Russia, but directly in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Every day we see Russians reporting the shortages. And of course, this ultimately psychological element here, essentially to bring the war finally to Russia. For many years, Russians have been able to live this war as if it was not happening, it wasn't concerning, it didn't concern them. We've seen that Moscovites essentially continue to live as usual. And the goal of Ukrainians is to demonstrate that that is no longer the case, that the strikes are very much an issue for every single Russian. And in combination with the worsening economic situation, the hope is to fundamentally alter the Russians' attitude to the war as if it wasn't their business, as if things can continue as usual. We've seen to some extent this is already happening. In May 2026, Russians named drones attacks as the main event of the month. So to an extent, Ukraine is already succeeding, you can argue.
Okay, so Maria, this is a military campaign, a political one, an economic one, and a psychological one, you're saying. So targeting not just the Russian military, but also the Kremlin, the public as well. And I'll get to public opinion later on in this interview. But first of all, tell me a bit more about these 40 days that we've been told about. It's a 40-day operation. How unusual is it to publicly announce such a time-bound operation?
Well, I would flag that here it seems that Zelensky and Ukrainians more broadly understand the importance of the operational momentum that they currently have during summer period in anticipation of what perhaps will be an even more difficult winter than the one they just endured. So I think that 40-day period essentially is part of that story. In addition, I imagine that the President Zelensky also hopes to demonstrate Russia's unwillingness to be a good faith negotiator in the peace talks, and that is aimed also at the West, especially, of course, at the U.S. President Trump, to show to him that any serious peace effort is impossible with the Kremlin. And accordingly, Zelensky issued this letter to President Putin calling for negotiations, but the goal is to demonstrate that the Kremlin really is not willing to seriously deliver. Lastly, there is tactical battlefield adaptation cycle that usually takes from several weeks to several months. And I imagine that this 40-day momentum also factors in Russia's ability to adapt. That unfortunately is still very much there. So we can anticipate that after a certain time, Russians will come up with ways to, adapt to this current pressure that Ukraine imposes on them.
But what do you think Ukraine can achieve in that time?
Well, I hope ideally, potentially, the goal would be to significantly cut off Russian forces in Crimea, perhaps push forward in that regard towards perhaps taking Crimea to some extent. And also they can significantly worsen the fuel shortages situation in Russia. I will just flag that this announced period of 40 days has just started, but the lines that your video has shown that we see in Moscow, the prices for gasoline for skyrocketing in Russia have already taken place. So from that perspective, I think within the 40-day framework, we potentially can see a full-blown fuel shortage in Russia unless the Kremlin figures unless the Kremlin figures out how to adjust to this situation.
Maria, could you tell me what you think the US and European allies, how they could interpret this escalation?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Zelensky approach has been very successful already. The recent G7 summit has actually come up with a united position of the members of the G7 on support for Ukraine and even more active work toward provision of the air defenses for Ukraine, one of the key issues for Ukraine currently in light of Russia's consistent strikes into Ukraine. So that is already happening. Ukraine is showing that it sort of holds the cards, so to speak, and most importantly, President Trump seems to have been shifting his posture, distancing himself from Putin and in favor of Ukraine. There are some rumors that he actually privately encouraged Zelensky to be even tougher on Putin. And we know that President Trump appreciates a stronger party, and Zelensky is very convincingly showing that Ukraine really holds the cards, and at the moment, you can argue it really has a momentum against Russia. So from that perspective, this is an important move. In addition, for Europe, it's very clear that Europe continues to be united in support of Ukraine, but also this momentum potentially provides for Europe more opportunities to outreach to the Kremlin and perhaps reoffer some diplomatic solutions. We have seen some actions on the side of European policymakers in that regard. I would be skeptical, about how successful they're going to be. There's no signs on the side of the Kremlin that there is really serious change, serious rethinking of their posture vis-a-vis Ukraine at the moment. But for Europe, it's also an important opportunity to reestablish itself as an important geopolitical player, diplomatic player in this war, and sort of try to reestablish some peace negotiations with the Kremlin.
Maria, what makes you optimistic that Europe really is so united?
Well, we've seen recently a few promising developments, including the defeat of Orban in the Hungarian election, which led to significant change in Hungarian posture vis-a-vis Ukraine, among other things.
What about Poland?
Because in the past, Poland situation is a little bit trickier. However, Poland, unlike Hungary, has a border with is very much. Unlike Hungary, Poland is much more aware of the danger that Russia represents to its national interest. And so even if Poland may have some internal tensions with Ukraine, has to do a lot of the way both countries understand the history, memory politics of the region. But altogether, Poland is very much aware of the dangers that Russia represents. And even more populist right governments in Poland continuously maintained a very strong anti-Kremlin posture. So from that perspective, I think regardless of the Ukraine's relationship, Poland will continue to hold quite an anti-Russian posture.
Okay, let's move on to the state of emergency in Crimea. How severe is the situation for the Moscow-appointed rulers there?
Well, it seems like effectively this season, the so-called the tourism season, is over for Crimea. We see that tourists are fleeing. There's empty embarkments on the videos. Essentially, this is going to be already a very significant blow to Crimea's economy. And on top of that, of course, there's very severe fuel shortages that started even sooner than what we've seen in the rest of Russia to some extent. So I think for Crimea, at least economically, this is already a very significant blow. When it comes to more significant battlefield breakthroughs, I think we need to wait for more developments. But altogether, this is not looking good for Russia at all.
And Crimea has long been presented by the Kremlin as secure and fully integrated. Does the current situation challenge that narrative?
Very much so. I mean, altogether, the Kremlin has absolutely failed to achieve its key goals in Ukraine since the start of this war. And that was actually pretty clear already before this summer. But what is changing now is that the Kremlin is now facing difficulties to hold on to what it controlled, the parts of Ukraine that it controlled before the 2022 reinvasion of Ukraine started. And from that perspective, it's not only failing to achieve its major goals in Ukraine, it's also failing to hold on to its past achievements. And clearly the picture is not looking good for Putin at all. He is widely seen as, failing, or at least not at all succeeding in this war. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure what is being communicated to him by his associates, right? He operates in his very constrained feedback loop when he only hears what he wants to hear. And I'm sure he still remains very hopeful about his ability to achieve future breakthroughs in Ukraine. Clearly, from his posture, his statements, Russia's continuing attacks on Ukraine. But altogether, from the broader international perspective, this is not looking good for Russia at all.
How well situated is Russia to defend Crimea?
Russia so far seems to have resorted to this a strategy of resistance, right? They're trying also to protect the existing logistical lines or rerouting them. There's significant evidence of the adaptation currently going on. The extent to which they will be able to fully protect the logistical lines from the current Ukraine's attacks is the key question, because so far it just doesn't seem like they have the ability to defend from the attacks that are coming from the sky. To a large extent, both countries are in the same situation because Ukraine is also suffering significantly from Russia's attacks. But right now, given Ukraine's advantage with the Starlink, the Hornets drones, and a significant technological adaptation where Ukraine holds an advantage, it's not very clear that Kremlin would be fully able to address this problem in Crimea.
But if Crimea becomes less secure, how much does that weaken Russia's overall war effort?
Definitely the loss or the threat of losing Crimea is a significant blow to Russia, since Crimea represents an important logistical hub, and from generally general impression that it showcases on the international stage, it's a major defeat. On top of that, if it were to lose Crimea, or at least being seriously threatened to lose it, on top of that, Crimea provides the leftover control of over the Black Sea. One area where Ukraine actually has had significant advantage in this war is pushing Russia out of the Black Sea. Russia significantly reduced its presence in the Black Sea, and Crimea is one of the last leftover, holdovers. Potentially, that also significantly undermines Russia's posture. And the unfortunate irony of it for Russia is that, again, Crimea occupation was always positioned by the Kremlin primarily as securing access to the Black Sea, which Russia is de facto losing as a result of its badly thought through invasion of 2022.
Okay, now let's talk about Putin's popularity as promised. You said he's surrounded by his yes men, but what about the public? Approval ratings are dropping fast, I believe. Is there a change in mentality in Russia?
To an extent. Since the start of this year, Putin's approval has lost about 10 to 12 percentage points, depends on the polls, but the polls more or less aligned, to the extent that the official pro-Kremlin polling agency TOM has announced that it's changing its methodology now in order to boost Putin's rating a little bit. But the irony is that even after they changed the methodology, Putin's approval continued to fall, even if not as dramatically in the surveys. So altogether, that is certainly a new development. We have seen before previous developments delivering some blow to Putin's approval, most importantly, the so-called partial mobilization in the fall 2022, but not so consistently and not under the events that were imposed by Ukraine, which is very important. Now, Ukraine is the agenda settler, not Russia anymore. What is the impact that change is going to have on Putin's battlefield effort in the long term? That's a major question. First of all, I will flag that after 2014 Crimea annexation and the war in Donbass, Putin's approvals held at high levels for 4 years until they started falling in 2018. probably due to disappearance of the rally around the flag effect. Today, we also see this decline that is associated simultaneously to 4 years passing. So it's possible that it's just the effect of disappearance of the rally around the flag effect, but it's also in combination with economic stagnation or even, possible economic decline and Ukraine strike. So we don't know for sure what to attribute this decline to. However, the decline is pronounced. It continues across several months, and it is associated with Russians reporting that drone strikes are major events of May. So I think we can really safely say that Ukraine definitely contributed to these perceptions. To date, the Kremlin has not been too responsive to the changes in this public approvals. Seemingly, it's true that they haven't called for another mobilization since late 2022, but it may have to do with other considerations like the lack of infrastructure or possible economic downsides rather than specifically the fear that this will further push the approval down. However, definitely public approval plays certain role, right? We see the propagandist effort to demonstrate to the Russians that nothing is going on, everything is normal, please do not look here, look at elsewhere, something else is more interesting than Russia's failing war effort, etc., etc. So from that perspective, it does play a role, and as it continues to decline, in combination with economic situation worsening in Russia, this potentially over the long term may become a deal breaker. However, I would flag that it will take quite some time until this really starts affecting the Kremlin thinking.
Okay, Maria, well, let's see if these factors or a combination of these factors actually force Putin to end this war, which would be a good thing for both sides. Maria, it's been great getting your take.
Thanks so much for having me.
And great having you along. Where do you think the war in Ukraine is going? Let us know. I'm Ben Fajzullin. See you again soon.